tariffs, there's been a lot of on and off, some inconsistency.
There's no inconsistency. I'm not like a block that just, I won't delay. It's called flexibility. It's not called inconsistency. It's called flexibility.
America, the birthplace of the automobile. A country shaken by economic turmoil, the waves of which have reverberated through the automotive industry's greatest symbols, such as Jeep, Dodge, Ram, and Chrysler. These brands, which have shaped the face of American industry for decades, are now on the brink of collapse. Mass layoffs, factory closures, and sharp increases in production costs, the consequences of Trump's tariffs, have left entire industry giants with no chance of survival.
That's a 10. That's a good one. Yeah.
The bet was made to protect their interests, but the result was disastrous. These are not just problems for automakers, they are a threat that has affected the lives of thousands of workers and called into question the future of entire brands. What happens next? Will one of the flagships of American industry, Stellantis, be able to regain its position amid the crisis? How will legendary brands such as Jeep, Dodge, Ram, and Chrysler survive this storm? And who will be to blame if the auto giants fail to survive the external threats?
After weeks of whiplash, Trump threatening tariffs, imposing some and walking back others, many Americans are feeling the uncertainty. In Swisher, Iowa, distillery owner Jeff Quint says it's paralyzing.
The bourbon industry is going to be collateral damage in this tariff war. I don't really think there's any way around that.
And he's not alone. Tonight, the majority of Americans, 61%, now say they disapprove of how the president is handling tariffs. 56% say they disapprove of his handling of the economy overall. But the president has dismissed those concerns tonight, saying he has the right to change course.
In this video, we reveal all the secrets behind the tragedy of the American auto industry. You will see how Trump changed the rules of the game, how his policies led to mass layoffs and factory closures, and what consequences this has for the global market. We will talk about Stellantis and its brands, which are going through difficult times, and ask the main question, do these cars have a chance to survive in a world where economic principles are changing faster than the speed on the road? Leave your thoughts in the comments, because in the next few minutes we will dive into a topic that could affect the future of the entire automotive industry and change the face of American brands forever.
US President Donald Trump has announced a 25% tariff on all car and light truck imports into the country. It's due to come into effect on April 2nd. Economists and world leaders are warning that it will be a tax on consumers and have a chilling effect on the global economy. But to Americans, Trump paints a rosy picture, predicting that the levies will spur growth.
The situation in which the American automotive industry found itself was predictable, but truly dramatic for many. After Trump introduced tariffs on imported cars and auto parts, the consequences were felt almost immediately. At first glance, it was a political decision aimed at supporting American manufacturing. However, as is often the case, the unexpected consequences proved to be far more devastating than originally anticipated. The crisis engulfed almost the entire market, forcing major manufacturers such as Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis to look for ways to survive in the new economic reality.
And police in Italy are investigating possible arson after a fire destroyed more than a dozen Tesla vehicles. Elon Musk is calling the incident at a Rome dealership terrorism. This comes as Tesla has been the target of recent protests around the world.
The process that began in 2018, when the Trump administration decided to impose tariffs on cars and auto parts from China and Europe, led to a sharp increase in production costs in America. While the tariffs were initially perceived as a temporary measure, after a few months it became clear that the consequences would be long-lasting and devastating for the entire industry. Factories that had previously been operating at full capacity were now forced to cut production. A number of car plants shut down indefinitely, leaving empty workshops and unemployed workers in their wake.
After Trump imposed those sweeping 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel imports, the European Union retaliating with tariffs on up to $28 billion of U.S. goods. Trump making it clear this isn't over, vowing to respond in kind with sweeping retaliatory tariffs early next month.
The tariffs were a real blow to Stellantis, a company that today owns iconic brands such as Jeep, Dodge, Ram, and Chrysler. These brands are not just symbols of American automotive culture, they are a real part of the country's history, known throughout the world. However, in the new economic environment, the company faced problems that could hardly have been predicted. While Chrysler used to be associated with luxury and quality, and Jeep with unlimited off-road capability and freedom, these brands now found themselves on the brink of survival. Many Stellantis plants across America were closed, with most of the jobs lost. According to data obtained from an internal company source, more than 30% of workers at some of Stellantis' key plants were laid off in 2020. This led to rising unemployment in areas such as Detroit, where the automotive industry has always been the backbone of the economy. But these were only the first signs. Over time, it became clear that not only internal problems with production capacity, but also international economic factors would play a role. When tariffs were introduced, most of the auto parts used to assemble cars in America came from abroad, including China. The sudden block on these imports led to significant supply disruptions, causing shortages of certain parts and materials. While companies tried to establish new supply chains, the cost of spare parts increased several times over. This, in turn, was reflected in the final price of cars, making it extremely difficult for many Americans to buy new models.
We begin with the president's trade war escalating tonight. This evening, the retaliation against the United States, Canada, and the European Union responding quickly, just hours after President Trump's 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum coming into the United States. Canada, the largest supplier of steel to the U.S., slapping new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods that are sold in Canada. And the 27 countries of the European Union imposing retaliatory tariffs on up to $28 billion worth of U.S. goods sold in Europe.
In addition, the rise in car prices caused by the introduction of tariffs also had negative consequences for brands such as Jeep and Ram. Faced with this situation, companies were forced to either reduce their production volumes or lower the quality of their products. Of course, neither of these strategies could be long-term, and manufacturers began to lose their competitiveness in the market. The onset of the crisis was much more complicated for Stellantis than one might think at first glance. At the height of its success, the company was experiencing rapid growth, conquering new markets. However, internal economic changes, such as tariff increases and rising material prices, became the decisive factor that turned its fortunes around. A sudden downturn in the automotive market forced the company to temporarily suspend production at its largest plants.
Ready? The higher the tariff, the more likely it is that the company will come into the United States and build a factory in the United States so it doesn't have to pay the tariff.
That will take many, as you know, that will take many years.
In fact, I'll tell you, there's another theory is that the tariff, you make it so high, so horrible, so obnoxious that they'll come right away. When I do the 10%, 10% is really, first of all, 10% when you collect it is hundreds of billions of dollars. The numbers that you're talking, all reducing our deficit. But really, so there's two ways of looking at a tariff. You can do it as a money-making instrument, or you can do it as something to get the companies. Now, if you want the companies to come in.
This was only the beginning. To make matters worse, consumer demand began to falter amid the economic turmoil. While car sales were booming during the boom years, the situation changed in 2020. Faced with rising car prices, Americans began to refrain from buying new cars. Buyers preferred to postpone their decisions in the hope that car prices would eventually fall. But this did not happen. Over time, despite the efforts of government agencies and attempts at internal restructuring, the market continued to lose stability. Many major players in the automotive industry were forced to make difficult decisions about job cuts and production closures. In 2022, Stellantis announced massive layoffs at its main plant in Detroit, resulting in the loss of half of its workforce. This move was justified by the high cost of labor and the inability to continue production with such a heavy burden on the company's finances.
with Elon Musk's views on weighing into very much national politics, national elections in Europe. And then on top of that, when you see the backdrop of Tesla upgrading its product line and the impact of them trying to chase more sales at the back end of last year, that means it's short on inventory. It can't necessarily sell as many vehicles or doesn't have as many in stock to sell. So there is that issue there of a confluence of impacts, which means that sales have been falling. Again, the question is how much more that will impact into February as well, given that the back end of last year in 2024, Tesla sales did slip overall.
The public reaction was overwhelming. There was talk of possible bankruptcy for Stellantis and other automotive brands such as Chrysler and Dodge. Despite this, amid general economic instability, it became clear that corporations would either have to undergo major restructuring or risk being swallowed up by stronger competitors. For several months, discussions about possible sales of brands, including Jeep and Ram, were the focus of attention. But the crisis did not only affect production lines, it also hit customers hard. Rising car prices led to a decline in demand for new models. And in 2023, according to statistics, car sales in the US fell by 25%.
I think you're going to remember today, it's going to be a free nation that we're dealing with. We're going to have a very free and beautiful nation. It's going to be Liberation Day in America, and it's going to be a day that hopefully you're going to look back in years to come and you're going to say, he was right. This has turned out to be one of the most important days in the history of our country.
The brands that suffered the greatest losses were those that had previously been associated with affordability and reliability, such as Dodge and Jeep. As a result of the tariffs, which caused prices to rise and consumer demand to fall, the largest brands in the American automotive industry found themselves on the brink of survival. More and more people began to doubt that these brands would be able to weather the storm caused by economic turmoil and the manufacturing crisis. The whole situation surrounding the Jeep, Dodge, Ram and Chrysler brands is not just an economic disaster for individual brands. It is a real test of survival for an entire segment of the American automotive industry that has always been proud of its history and traditions. The process that began back in 2018 with Trump's introduction of tariffs has now led to real drama for Stellantis. The problems faced by these brands have proven to be much deeper and more serious than just higher car prices. They have affected the very foundations of the industry: production, supply chains, factory operations, and of course the livelihoods of thousands of workers. In response to the economic challenges, Stellantis has attempted to maintain its market position, but unfortunately, all of the company's efforts have been doomed to failure. Jeep, as one of the most popular and recognizable brands, has found itself at the center of this crisis. Immortalized in culture as a symbol of freedom and adventure, Jeep has now become a symbol of the struggle for survival. Supply problems, increased production costs, and job cuts began to threaten not only the brand's financial health, but also its reputation. In addition, in the highly competitive SUV and crossover market, Jeep found itself under pressure from cheaper Chinese and European models, which began offering similar vehicles at more affordable prices. But the crisis did not spare other Stellantis brands. Dodge, known for its powerful cars and sports models, found itself in an even more difficult position. With the decline in Americans' purchasing power, demand for cars such as the Challenger and Charger fell significantly. These cars, once symbols of American strength and power, have now become difficult for the average consumer to afford due to rising prices. In addition, problems with the supply of critical parts such as engines and transmissions have severely hampered Dodge's production lines. Factories that used to operate around the clock now often stood idle due to a lack of components. Those plants that did try to maintain production were unable to reach their previous volumes, which inevitably led to a decline in profits. Ram, in turn, faced what could be called the extinction of its traditional market. The pickup truck market had always been strong and reliable, but with the introduction of tariffs and a decline in purchasing power in the country, people became less willing to spend money on expensive trucks. Moreover, competition from manufacturers in China and Mexico became extremely fierce, putting additional pressure on Ram. Pickup truck production capacity also began to decline, and workers began to lose their jobs, which had an impact on social and economic aspects. The crisis also affected Chrysler, which, despite its long history and prestige, was unable to adapt to the new conditions in time. These brands had a hard time because their products were no longer in demand as they had been before. Models that were once associated with high quality and comfort could not compete with more modern and cheaper alternatives offered by other manufacturers. The lack of updates to the model range and price increases for older cars were the final nail in the coffin for Chrysler, which found itself in a cult position. During the crisis, when Ford and General Motors began to intensify competition and promote new, cheaper, and more energy-efficient models, Stellantis found itself trapped. There was no way to massively update the model range, as the high cost of spare parts and the unavailability of some components significantly slowed down production. And despite attempts to find a solution, rising car prices made them unaffordable for ordinary buyers, causing a serious decline in sales. Each of these brands faced consequences not only from the economic crisis but also from changes in consumer behavior. People began to realize that buying expensive cars in an unstable economy was no longer practical. In response, Stellantis companies began to cut production plans, close factories, and reduce the number of models in their range. Problems with the availability of components and increases in the prices of key parts also forced Stellantis to reduce the number of production lines at its factories. This led to mass layoffs and reduced working hours at the factories. The key issue for these brands was not that they had lost their uniqueness or stopped producing good cars. The problem was that the world was changing, and automakers, especially those operating in traditional markets, were unable to respond quickly enough to these changes. Models that were once considered symbols of the American auto industry were now facing a real threat of extinction. Falling demand, supply difficulties, and competition from cheap and modern cars all threatened the survival of these brands. Meanwhile, other companies began to gain momentum. Chinese manufacturers became increasingly competitive with each passing year, while European auto giants adapted to the new conditions more quickly. Local factories that had previously operated at full capacity were now trying to maintain at least some presence in the market. But even that proved to be a difficult task. Competition from new market players only exacerbated the problems of traditional brands. As a result, Jeep, Dodge, Ram, and Chrysler faced a real threat to their survival, and their future now depended on their ability to adapt to the new conditions, which not everyone managed to do in time. When the crisis reached its peak in 2023, the consequences became apparent, not only for manufacturers but for the entire automotive industry as a whole. Many car factories were closed or reduced their operations. Hundreds of thousands of jobs disappeared, and those who remained faced new challenges. Demand for cars declined, and production capacity remained at only 40% of previous levels. This led to a massive economic downturn in regions that were most dependent on the automotive industry. In Detroit, for example, which had traditionally been the center of automobile manufacturing in the US, the impact of the crisis was particularly severe. The entire city, which had once thrived on Ford and Chrysler factories, now found itself in dire straits. Families, many of whom had worked in car factories for several generations, lost their jobs, and local businesses were unable to stay afloat. At that point, the city was experiencing a real economic eclipse. Unemployment in some areas reached 25%, and the unemployed were unable to find new jobs as the industry was virtually paralyzed. Production stoppages, which became regular during the crisis, began to affect smaller companies that manufactured parts for large automotive companies. One such company was a transmission plant in Ohio that supplied components for Dodge and Ram. In early 2023, when the crisis reached a critical point, the plant announced that it was suspending operations, laying off nearly 600 people. Instead of its usual production volumes, the company was forced to operate at only 20% of its capacity, which led not only to mass layoffs, but also to the threat of permanent closure. The city, which was entirely dependent on this plant, found itself on the brink of ruin. Supply problems and a sharp rise in production costs were the factors that became the real catalysts for the economic disaster in the automotive industry. In 2023, despite all its restructuring efforts, Stellantis faced the real threat of complete collapse. Brands such as Jeep and Chrysler, which had long been considered flagships in the American market, were unable to withstand price competition from cheaper Chinese models. For those who remained loyal to American cars, dissatisfaction with quality and price began to grow. Comparing older Jeep models with new Chinese SUVs, buyers began to realize that they could get more functionality and innovative technology for the same price. This led to a sharp decline in demand for classic American models, leaving automakers at a crossroads. But the problems did not end there. Lower car prices put even more pressure on manufacturers, as each model was sold at a loss. This also affected Ram pickups and Dodge sports cars. To maintain profits, Stellantis began implementing a series of radical measures, including reducing the cost of materials. This, in turn, caused even greater disappointment among consumers. Then, in March 2023, it was discovered that several new Jeep and Ram models had failed mandatory safety certification, sparking a wave of negative press coverage. This was a real blow to brands that had always been associated with high reliability and safety.